That was the mom voice because I don't have it. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Eitan Nasreddin-Longo, and I've been asked by the Attorney General's Office to facilitate these fora. This is the fourth around the state. They started work back in May, I think so. I also have been helped in this process by Tabitha Moore here, who is the founder and president of the Rutland chapter of the NAACP, and Curtis Reed, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, who is the founder and executive director of the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity. So thank you both for your help and participation as well. I have some things to say to start us off, and other people do too, and then I'm going to shut up because it really is about the community. Some people have wondered why we do this and why these fora have been convened at this time. I think it's pretty clear to everyone in this room there has certainly been, not merely in Vermont, but since we're in Vermont, that's our real focus right now, a rise in hate crimes and bias-related incidents. Most dramatically, the elephant in the room that no one wants to discuss, or maybe some people do and some people don't, is the incident that happened with Representative Morris of Bennington. The Attorney General felt that he and his office needed to get more information about hate crimes and bias-related incidents from people in the community, and therefore they are sponsoring this and asked us to facilitate. There are others here outside of the AGO who have information about these crimes and incidents and how they might be addressed. And when we do introductions, they can introduce themselves. Nobody from the Attorney General's office, nor from the various organizations or agencies that are going to be represented here tonight, are here to lecture you, but they're here to provide information that may be helpful. When we did the first forum in Winooski, there was a gentleman who was, I think the only thing to say, he was gardening while black. And he was really sort of, can you imagine? Frustrated, imagine that. By the response that he felt he was getting or not getting from law enforcement, and he wasn't sure what to do for redress. What was wonderful at that moment was Boryang, who, I'm jumping the gun here, who is the executive director of the Human Rights Commission. She came in and she said, well, one of the things you might do. So it actually ended up being very interactive and very helpful, and that man walked out of here, or out of that forum, and felt actually fairly empowered. It was really kind of a cool moment. So that's why these other folks are here. They're here to provide information, as I say, and not to lecture. The point of the event is for the members of the community to basically provide testimony, to speak out. I know people from the AGO, oh God, Attorney General's Office, I'm starting to do the acronym thing, I'm sorry. They take notes, and they're listening very carefully, and so please speak out. So, let me introduce the Attorney General of the state of Vermont, who would like to welcome us. T.J. Donovan.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming out tonight to talk about the issues of race, racism, and hate that's happening not only in Brattleboro but across our state. And the remarkable thing about these forums, and I want to thank Tabitha, Curtis, and Eitan, and so many others, is we're not here to speak. We're not here to lecture. We're here to listen and to hear stories that are happening to folks that, frankly, we're never going to hear about in Montpelier for a variety of different reasons. Because many of these incidences of bias, of hate, and discrimination, and racism, for a number of reasons, may not rise to the level of a crime. And oftentimes when those calls are made to police, those calls end with the police because it may not rise to a crime. What we're trying to do is understand how pervasive the issue of racism is, how it impacts not just people of color, but the entire community. And really, I think for me, is to have a willingness to listen and to reflect, to understand my own privilege. Quote Meg Smith, who is the head of the Vermont Women's Fund, and she was talking about having a conversation about white privilege. And her words resonated for me because I think this is what we've been trying to do, that when we're criticized for it, and perhaps criticize is not the right word, but that's the word I'll use. The challenge for us is not to take that as an admonishment, but rather as an invitation to listen and to learn and to reflect. And so we're here in that spirit, understanding that we simply don't have all the answers, but our goal is to treat everybody fairly, to protect everybody under the law, to make sure people who have not been heard are being heard, to validate people's experiences, and to find a path forward to address these issues of hate and racism that exist not only in this community but throughout this state. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to listening. Thank you.
So what we'd like to do now are introductions just around the circle. Do not feel that you have to. We certainly recognize that this can be a sensitive situation. People don't necessarily want to have their names put out. Don't feel that you need to, so we're going to just go around. And if you want to introduce yourself, please do. Otherwise, pass it on to the next person. Why don't we just keep going this way, because we've already started. Eitan.
Tabitha, Eitan.
Curtis. Tabitha Halbert. Yes, so that's one hat. Well, the other hat that I wear, which is somewhat relevant, is I'm the chair of the Vermont Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. So, but I'm here in the capacity of Vermont Partnership. But just know that's in the background.
Or Yang, and I am the Executive Director of the Vermont Human Rights Commission.
Gary Scout, State Police. I'm the Captain and Director of Fair and Impartial Policing.
Terry Byrne, I have about 47 years in law enforcement on all levels. Like Curtis, I serve on the Vermont Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I also serve with Gary, the head here of the State Police Fair and Impartial Policing Committee.
Will Sunday, Vermont Attorney General's Office.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Yandel. I also work in the Vermont Attorney General's Office in Communications and Community Outreach.
Maya Holiday, Superintendent of Schools.
Ann Beekman, Vice Chair of the Western Southeast School Board and Chair of the Diversity and Equity Committee.
Carrie Amadon, I'm on the Vernon School Board.
Brenda Siegel, I'm a Newfane resident.
Tristan Tolino, one of 3 representatives from Brattleboro for the Vermont Legislature.
I'm Susie Webster Tolino. I am a community member and a minister in Westminster West.
Sheila Upton, she, her pronouns, and I'm with the Root Social Justice Center.
Isabel Williams, community member here in Brattleboro and also involved in the Root Social Justice Center.
Jeanette White, one of the 2 senators from Wyndham County.
Russ Quebec, one of the citizens of Brattleboro.
TJ Dunn, Attorney General.
Julio Thompson, Attorney General's Office, Civil Rights Unit.
Wichi Abdu, resident in Brattleboro, volunteer at the Root, and I work at the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital.
My name is Krista Yagin. I'm a parent of a child with a disability. I live in Guilford and I'm an educator.
Hi, I'm Olga Peters and I'm a reporter with the Commons.
David Chair, Attorney General's Office, Community Justice.
Lisa Sparrow, I'm the pastor of the Guilford Church, and I also am a diversity chair for the Vermont State Social Outreach Committee.
Diana Wally, I'm with the Community Equity Collaborative serving the Brattleboro area.
Peter Elwell, I'm the town manager here in Brattleboro.
Chris Mears, I'm a reporter from the Brattleboro Reformer.
Mary Gannon with the Community Equity Collaborative, and I'm also a local teacher educator on issues of social justice.
Stefan Gillum, president of the Windham County, Sussex County's NAACP branch, and therapist.
I'm Jules Torty. I coordinate the Civil Rights Program at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Vermont, which is the federal law enforcement agency in Vermont. And it means I'm also the point of contact for any Implicit Bias-related incidents.
Nader Hashim, state representative for Windham 4 and former trooper, also on the Fair and Impartial Policing Committee.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go, what? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I'm Abby Lever. I am an investigator in the Civil Rights Unit of the Attorney General's Office.
I'm Natasha. I'm an intern at the Attorney General's Office.
Forgive me. I thank you. Thank you, Sheila. I'm blonde. Well, I don't have eyes in the back of my head. Thank you. I want to turn back to Julio Thompson, who, as he says, he's Assistant Attorney General and he is the Director of the Civil Rights Unit, because he will give us some direction around what hate crimes and bias-related incidents are. We have found that to be useful as this has gone on, these fora, and he's in a position to do that kind of definition for us. So, take it away.
Hi again, everybody. So when we talk about a hate crime under Vermont law and really under federal law, the first thing you have to have is whatever the thing you're complaining about has to be a crime. If it's not a crime, like maybe it's vandalism, maybe it's burglary, maybe it's an assault, or a criminal threat. If it's not a crime, it can't be a hate crime. Hate crime is a way to, under Vermont law, and Jules can talk about federal laws because there are different federal hate crime laws, but basically it's an increased level of punishment if that underlying crime was motivated by bias against an individual on the basis of a number of different categories that includes race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, age, and veteran status. In the Civil Rights Unit, we also deal with employment discrimination for things that might not be crimes. We hear about sexual harassment, many forms of racial harassment. Many forms of harassment don't constitute crimes, but they still might be a violation of our civil laws. The Human Rights Commission addresses not only employment discrimination for state employees, but also public accommodations, so discrimination in restaurants, schools, government services, and housing. So some of these acts of bias, when we talk about bias incidents, might be things where you're not going to go to jail for it, but you might nonetheless be subject to a lawsuit for damages, a court order for an injunction to keep you away from people or to keep you from engaging in certain activities or subject to fines. And then there's a third class of bias-related incidents where it doesn't violate a civil law, doesn't violate criminal law might be biased, but it might be in the area of constitutionally protected free speech that's nonetheless upsetting to the community, might be isolating or placing people in fear, even if it doesn't count as a violation of the law. And I think as we go on, it's in that area in particular where there aren't laws that prohibit that conduct, that the community's response is probably, and their power is probably the greatest, and our ability as government officials is probably at its weakest. So we're very interested not only in hearing what you're seeing out there in Vermont, but also your ideas about how we can share information together to make sure that we as all Vermonters are responding to these things either in a criminal justice sense or in a civil remedy sense or in a community response to let people know where we stand and what we won't tolerate as a community.
Thank you. Okay, getting closer to everybody else talking and me shutting up. Something I want to talk about are the terms of the discussion, and this actually is kind of important because it addresses issues of libel, and that's really kind of critical here. When you are providing testimony, please do not include names of specific people. In other words, you could say something to the effect of the personnel at establishment X, or a white male yelled racial epithets at me, but not Mr. X sent me to Y's office where I was given a 3-day suspension. Be a little more vague on that. And as I say, not making a specific reference to a specific person. The second thing here would be, please refrain from making accusations about specific people. It would be fine to say, I believe I was given this detention because of my race, but not Mr. X is a racist. Okay? I understand that it's tempting to go ahead and do that. I get it. We have had that happen. It's been kind of tense. Please recall that these are legal protections, and I ask you to resist the temptation to call someone out. Those same protections protect minorities and minority communities when the system's working right. And to violate those is in some sense to do damage to those protections that can protect minority communities. I would ask you to keep that in mind. And please just do. We just had a moment in Rutland that did not go very well. And I was like, oh Lord. And then Tabitha had to use her mom's voice. So, yes, I just want to know that. So what we're going to do is the 5 minutes, right?
For people from the community.
Right, for people in the community who are giving testimony. You have 5 minutes to speak. If someone from the Attorney General's office or from one of the other organizations or agencies that are represented here has a helpful response, they have 3 minutes to respond. Tabitha is a fearsome timekeeper, okay? I'm a wuss, but she's not. Don't piss her off. And we're gonna go round and around until time is up. We have till 7:30. And now?
Well, when Tom says that you have 5 minutes, that's just for the first round. And obviously, if you're
Right.
in the middle of a gut-wrenching story, I'm not gonna be like, excuse me, shut up.
Right.
You can continue. But we want to be respectful of the fact that there are quite a few people in this room with a whole lot of stories, and we want to give room for everybody to at least get through one round before opening it up again. Does that make sense? And then the 3 minutes is meant so that the space is held majority for the community. However, if the person responding to you is saying something that you need to hear, you as the person being spoken to can say, no, I want them to have more time. Does that also feel decent?
So, as we launch into this, we've had different ways of doing it in different places. What we did in Winooski is not exactly what we did in Hartford, which is not exactly what we did in Rutland. So I want to throw out there as we open this up, we really would like to maximize participation. And we recognize that many factors might influence participation. What can we do, or what needs to happen tonight in order for people in the community to feel most empowered and respected? Do you want to give some feedback on that? Because I didn't get a lot of feedback from the community in terms of what might be wanted. So I want to open that up now, because I want to facilitate my forum. If anyone's got anything, this is a great moment. Perfect moment.
I think it's important if people to kind of put a psychological lens on a few things. And so if people are if they have a response or they're having a trauma response or something like that, not to take it as a personal attack, that they might just in fact be flooded at that time.
Okay.
And so to keep in perspective people's positionality within the conversation and how there's like a trauma.
Thank you. Good point. Sheila.
Sometimes I don't like being vulnerable.
But sometimes, depending on how you navigate through the world as well, how people show up and the ways that they show up can be cause trauma as well. So one of the things I think I was giving feedback before this was that people who are in their official capacities, such as officers, coming into a community space in this with full uniform and armed is not how I would invite people into a forum where people are sharing their experiences, their traumas, and some of those are connected and are related to law enforcement. And so just having law enforcement present, and then to have the addedness of being uniformed and armed, I think brings a presence for some people that's very uncomfortable and that will silence people and shut them down, and or will monitor what is said because of that.
I was asking whether or not there's something we could potentially do. Like, I got some sweats, Gary. No, in addition to him being an officer, like, he can't change that, but you're right. Did you want to speak to that factor? No? You want my sweats? You can dress me. Thank you, Sheila.
Then I guess we open it up. This is when stories have been told in some ways. This is when we in Winooski's first heard about the gentleman who was in his garden, his front garden, in fact, and a neighbor saw him and just didn't think he belonged at his house. And he had some questions about how law enforcement handled it. He had some frustrations about how it was handled. In fact, when the conversation got going, there were reasons why it got handled the way it did. They had not conveyed it, perhaps, to him in a way that was helpful. But after the forum, everything was lovely. So he really got a sense of what had been going on, and law enforcement got a sense of what it needed to do better. So there was some real movement there. People just started telling stories at this point. They started relating their experiences. Please feel free to do so. And I'm going to back away now.
Please feel free to ask questions as well.
I'm sort of wondering if it's possible maybe to start with questions. Like maybe the questions might be easier to get at the feelings and experiences. I know that I appreciate Leah giving a little brief summary of what a hate crime is, but there's so many other questions that I and the community might have in terms of, for example, a question I have is discretion points and chain of commands. There's a bunch of, half a dozen people or so that's engaged or involved in different entities, and sort of wondering when an alleged hate crime may happen, like if I'm the person saying an alleged crime might have happened, who do I even go to first? And whether that starts locally or whether that starts state, and who are the actual chain of command, and within that chain of command, who's accountable to who through that chain of command specifically? Is that a question you have?
I just want to, I think that's the key issue. And I want to thank you for framing that issue. And because accountability to the community is critically important, and responsiveness from local law enforcement to the community is critically important. And from the Attorney General's position from a statewide, that's incredibly hard to do because we have local government when it comes to law enforcement. The United States Attorney bias incident reporting system, because Sheila, your question, I think, is the critical question of this issue in terms of responsiveness and accountability. And I think some of the gaps that do exist, because look, when bad things happen, you're going to call 911. And when they don't respond because it doesn't rise to a level for whatever reason or is civil, it stops and ends there. That's the challenge I think we need to address.
So, a bias incident could violate state law, and in some cases even a local ordinance. It could violate a federal law. And so you might have different overlapping authorities who all have the ability to do something about it or have the authority to do something. So there are certain things, a certain hate crime that might violate a federal law or might not, depending on what the actual circumstances are. It's based upon what the Vermont legislature defined as a Vermont hate crime and what Congress defined as different hate crimes or civil rights violations. One thing that we've been doing this year, I think we've been doing it informally for a number of years, but we wanted to formalize it this year, was to ensure to have multiple points of entry. So that if someone is not, I think if someone is in an immediate urgent safety situation, like immediate threat, most people do call 911, but sometimes something happens and they don't call right away. They can call our office under the bias incident reporting system. They can call the Human Rights Commission, who will put the person in touch with the right person to notify us, and we'll try to get the right people to respond to it. Sometimes people call us and what they're alleging is not a crime, but it might be a violation of wage and hour law or an OSHA law. And what we wanted to try to do was to allow our office to help be a clearinghouse so you don't have to figure out who to call. Let us figure it out. We have basically a phone tree of sorts to make sure we're getting to the right people. And sometimes it's multiple people. Something that might be investigated by local police might also be something that violates federal law. So when we get that information, we contact the state's attorney, we contact the state's police, we contact the U.S. Attorney's Office in case this is something that the FBI might, or the U.S. attorneys might be involved in. If it's something that involves housing or public accommodations, it's something we would notify the board, the Human Rights Commission, just so we all know what's going on in the community, and to have that conversation among ourselves to figure out who actually has legal authority, and try to discuss amongst ourselves the most sensible approach. If you have something that violates multiple laws, you have to decide, well, who's going to go first, because people don't like talking to government officials, in these kind of, most people don't. They're afraid or they're worried about retaliation. And what we try not to have is three of us successively going up to a neighbor's house saying, did you see anything, right? So local cop does it, and then maybe our investigator, Abby, does it. Maybe Board has somebody who shows up. But rather coordinate amongst ourselves, okay, is this a case that's going to go criminal or forensic evidence? Yes. Okay. Sure.
I don't think it quite answered the question. So what I heard was a clearinghouse of multiple people, which included everywhere from 911 to the U.S. Attorney General, depending on what laws it filters through what people. But could you just explain a little bit more focused, if somebody from Brattleboro was experiencing a hate crime today, what does that currently look like? Not what we would like it to look like, what does it really look like right now when that happens?
So if someone contacts the police department,
Brattleboro 911.
Not Brattleboro PD, Brattleboro Police Department notifies the state's attorney's office, who then in turn notifies us, the Attorney General's office. If this is something that might involve, we think it's a hate crime allegation, we will notify the U.S. Attorney's office. If the local state's attorney hasn't been notified, we will notify them as well. so that everyone knows. If it involves something that might be in the Human Rights Commission's authority, we notify them as well, usually all at once.
I think one of the gaps that exists is a lot of times that call to 911 dispatch, it starts and ends there, and it never gets to the state's attorney, who's going to have the jurisdiction for that crime in Brattleboro. And I'll use an example because I think it's easy to illustrate. In Burlington, the Shane case, the guy was giving KKK flyers to, evidence was 2 women of color, nobody else. They called 911. The dispatcher said it's not a crime. And I was only contacted because one of the women had a friend who knew me and called me on my personal cell phone. That's how we got involved. That's not a system that works. Talking about privilege, right? And so I think what Julio's talking about is trying to build those gaps because, first of all, our challenge is it has to be more than a phone tree, right? So, but how do we bring more players on the field to look at this, to say this is a priority, that it may not be on its face a criminal charge that the state's attorney is going to file tomorrow, whether it's a disorderly conduct, that underlying crime, engaging in threatening behavior with the enhancement of a hate crime, right? Because a hate crime is the sentence enhancement. A hate crime by itself is not going to be a crime. You have to have the underlying crime, but if it's motivated by hate, race, then it's a sentence enhancement. That's usually going to be the state's attorney. Could be us too. But if it's in that gray area where it may not be that a crime, that prima facie crime, then this is where we need to bring the U.S. Attorney's Office, the AG's office, board's office in to say, what is the legal recourse in order to address this bias incident? And I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but for me, it's always about bringing more people onto the scene to look at this, to say, do we have a violation here? What's the appropriate response, as opposed to just saying to the person, nothing happened here, we can't help you.
I was going to actually ask you something you wanted to add, because you seem like you're a good person on this.
Yeah, I mean, our office does handle hate crime, so I can give information, but I also wanted to ask a question back after if I could. So, two things. One, this bias-related incident reporting system that Julio talked about. I think the hope is that if you experience something, it was a non-emergent situation, but you felt like it was a hate crime, and you told Tabitha, for example, and she gave me a call, I would also route the complaint into the system and send it out to Julio, who would send it out to all the people that he would just describe. I think the hope is that it doesn't just come in through law enforcement, that we're able to capture, provide support as their system, but they're able to capture stuff that comes in a little bit less formally than you call 911. So that's one reporting mechanism. We do at the federal level, you can always call 1-800-CALL FBI, and they have a tip line. Anything you say about hate crimes happening in Vermont will come to me. And so that's another way to kind of get the concern heard and report it. But my question back was just what you would do in that situation right now. Where would you go? And so we can try to understand how to get to that, right? Because I think there's a lot of people in the room who are it's our job. I mean, I want to know about these things that are happening, and so I want to know where to go to hear it. You also asked a question about essentially where does the buck stop? That I think we can do a better job answering that question too, but that's, we can talk about that after or now, whatever your preference is.
So the response is, I personally have used all of those resources before. And some have been more effective than others. And it's a phone tree of around and around and around and around and around, where everybody's talking, but nobody's actually talking to the person who is most impacted, informing the person who's most impacted, educating the person who's most impacted, having that person who's most impacted be a part of those discussions, giving them the information that they need, and then usually it dissipates. So right now, if I was to have a situation like this, I would probably go to my state's attorney if it was a local issue because I have a relationship. But that's only because I have a relationship. I would not necessarily readily go to that agency or know to go to that agency or feel like I had access or equal or equitable access to that agency to do something like that. But because of the relationships that I've formed with numerous people and entities, including that one, I would go there personally. But that's a privilege that I have as well.
I actually have a question on accessibility. Going off of that, and really addressing the accessibility in a safety, in my own feelings. So I understand that recently, I came to the knowledge that recently the Blue Lives Matter flag has come up on the Brattleboro Fire Department, and I understand we got taken down. The thing is that it still happened, and I don't think me as a person of color in Brattleboro has heard anything about what has happened afterwards. And I would like to know, because as part of accessibility is knowing that I can be safe in contacting, the Brattleboro Police Department if that's my first go-to. So my question is then, I don't know if there's representatives here from the Brattleboro Police Department, but what kind of education has gone into educating why Blue Lives Matter may be problematic? And then what is the PR that's happening to communicate to the people of color within Brattleboro, or at least to the community of Brattleboro, of how the police department is actually trying to make it a safer place?
Do we have representatives? I don't think we do.
Well, actually, that was what I was going to check.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, so as Sheila, as you were speaking, I was doing a broad sweep around the room, recognizing that when people did the go-around, there was nobody here that recognized themselves as part of the protocol. So for me, that's a problem tonight. That feels like a real problem. So I think we need to be honest about that and transparent, that we don't have anybody here from our local law enforcement. And for me, that's almost indicative of some of the other issues that are getting raised here tonight. And so I know we're not supposed to call out names, and I called out the Brattleboro Police Department.
that's not.
Okay.
That's not a.
But I think we just need to keep it real, because that is some of what I think some of us are here tonight to speak to. And so I will just speak as someone of privilege. I have not been victimized around the kinds of issues that we're talking about. I've done a lot of support with people who have been, and as part of the work with the Community Equity Collaborative, and I'm thinking, Sheila, again, your question about, Brattleboro, we're fortunate that we do have these advocacy groups and support groups that I think people actually go and use more so than going to law enforcement. People go to the Root Social Justice Center. People go to NAACP. People go to the Women's Freedom Center. People come and talk to members of the Community Equity Collaborative. So people will go to Vermont Partnership, or used to go there years ago when there was an advocacy program. So, honestly, what I want to say is that I don't live in this community, I live in New Hampshire. And one of the reasons why I continue to come to this community and work here and engage is because there is collective community responses that are outside of these larger government, local law enforcement, et cetera, services. And I think we need to be honest and transparent about that, which is one of the reasons why I think even when I look at some of the work I'm doing across the state right now, what folks are saying generally is that the first place they won't go to is law enforcement. And I remember someone, I'm very close in this community, a woman of color, who said, we need to talk about not going to law enforcement when things are happening here. So I just want to be honest that that really is the narrative that's happening. And I'm very disappointed that we don't have somebody here from our local Brattleboro Police Department tonight.
So yeah, I kind of want to follow up on that point too, with a few other things that I'm also thinking about as the conversation circulates. The first one is that to me there seems like an obvious gap in what we can do through the legal, attorney-based way to address hate crimes, and maybe what the state could be doing through the lawmakers as far as the issue around what it looks like to take action towards hate crimes if they have to be stacked onto something else, which to me makes not a lot of sense. As a person of color, I've heard it plenty of times, but it never makes sense, and maybe it doesn't make sense to y'all either. But I'm just saying it never makes sense to me. But I feel like that is a gap that maybe we could be, as a community, working to figure out how we could try to close through policy or law creation on the legislator level, or maybe on the state policy level in some way. I don't know. That's a much larger, bigger conversation. Another thing, though, that I wanted to bring up is that there are policing usually policies that I feel like halter the system. So we have what I call a bird's eye view, right, from the top tier macro system level, and then you've got people on the ground who are coming to the NAACP, for example. Right now we're handling 2 different cases that have been kind of ongoing in this county that I have jurisdiction to facilitate around. But the issue is that when you get into these spaces, there are lots of policies within those police departments for handling complaints, and things die there all the time. And it's very intimidating for a community member or for an organization to go in time after time after time again, and then to be hit with these policies. And I'm not knocking the policies necessarily, but I think that we have a praxis problem. In theory, they're supposed to work great. In practice, they're not so smooth. They're not working so great. So I think that's another area that needs addressing, and that needs more conversation. And then also, I love that we're speaking about things in a systematic way. That's great. But we also, if we're going to use the system perspective, we need to talk about interpersonal relationships and the fact that we're in a small state and people have friendships and allyships, and there is a lot of that happens as well. Oh, that's my friend. I don't know if I necessarily want to, I don't know, right? And so I think that we also need to have a conversation that is transparent in that way as well, and that addresses not only the structural stuff, but the interpersonal relationships and kind of how people take that in and what they do with that systematically and how it's impacting all of us.
I guess I just want to talk about how that system breaks down a little as well. The Attorney General already knows about the situation, but earlier this year, after supporting Representative Morris, I started being harassed online, and very anti-Semitic things were said. I was told that a white supremacist group was referenced, and that I was going to be, and that the Jews will be exiled again. And the person knew a lot about my family history. They knew they knew that I was Ashkenazi, for example. So obviously had been following the campaign since I had made this support. I happened to be able to contact TJ directly, and he told me to contact the Brattleboro police or the state police. I contacted the Brattleboro police. They never even called me back because I'm from Newfane. And then I contacted the state police, but they never, I didn't ask where it happened or anything. And then I contacted the state police. And the first officer that I spoke with said, well, what do you want me to do about it? Because it wasn't going to rise to a crime. And they said it in a way that actually, as I think everyone in this community knows, I don't easily back down. I'm sure our Attorney General knows that too. And I didn't want to call back. So I then again contacted our Attorney General and said I don't know what to do because they don't seem to really want to take the report. And I just wanted to be reported because I'm a single person living at home and I live a half an hour from this guy and I'm scared. And I also, because I know that he has a history. And he encouraged me. I wouldn't have called back if I hadn't been encouraged to call back. And it was an issue of access that I was encouraged. And so I think that was privilege also. And so to me, the idea that there's a bias reporting system that somewhat does rely on us contacting police officers, when I think it's easy to be shut down by a police officer if they feel that I felt I was being a little ridiculous, so it was easy to shut me down on that, but I was also scared. And so I think that's easy to be shut down by officers that may have their own bias. I mean, perhaps that officer, I don't know, had their own bias about me being Jewish.
Fine. I heard that you were younger Saturday morning. And to your point, Vermont is small, and I think that's part of the problem, though. I mean, I pride myself on accessibility, but not everybody has my cell phone number. And so let's just acknowledge that. And, you know, this constant debate of accessibility and privilege and who knows who. You're absolutely right. Which I think is amplified because we're so small. And the issue of training, of cultural competency, of accountability is huge in law enforcement, from me all the way down to the person that answered the phone for you. But I want to say this, how our process works, this gets back and married to your point, that in order for us to have a case, to have a file, it has to start with the police. It doesn't start with us. We're not fact finders. We're the lawyers. And so the first people we need, and I'm not saying, so do this, I know we have work to do, I just want to explain the process from our end, is it's got to go to Captain Scott. It's got to go to the police first because we need them to have an investigation. And if we're hearing, which we are, that a lot of people in this state do not want to go to the police or to law enforcement, we need to fix this. And it's on us to fix it. And we need your help about how to fix it because obviously we're not doing it right.
I guess what I would add to that is that your first call doesn't have to be to the police. Most people do that. They can call more at the Human Rights Commission. They can call us. People have for years call us. It's the first. We ask them, this sounds like a crime, have you contacted local police? They haven't. First thing we do internally is we assign an investigator, and then we have them talk with the victim to find out whether they're comfortable going to the police, whether they're danger. If they're traumatized, we have an in-house victims advocate, Amy Farr, who will talk to them to get a sense if they need a safety plan. Are they in a position even to do an interview yet? And if they are looking for law enforcement response, then we call the law enforcement agency, which I think might hear the call differently than if it's coming randomly from someone else. And I think that would be true if that came from any other member of this network where, if someone reports a crime to Board is not going to ignore that.
But how do we, sorry, can I answer this? Okay. How do we know if we're not me or Sheila? How do we know that we can call the human rights? That's what my problem is, that I happen to know those things by way of having run for office. That's really how I know. Otherwise, I may not know some of that. Right. Most of us haven't done that. And so how does the other people who ought to have access to those same fixes know?
This may not be helpful, but I just want to sort of put out there, just so you know, this has come up at every forum that we've done so far.
That is helpful.
Every one we've done has been a question of access. How do we know? Has been the fundamental question that's come up, and then I get on my high horse and start screaming about the Human Rights Commission. Call the Human Rights Commission. They need a brochure or something that's like all over the place. But
so can I just add? I guess you don't know until you do know, and we do these forums, or we try to put ourselves out there as much as we can with the limited resources that we have to get people to know us. But I think there's a question here, or the big elephant in the room is what is happening once you are able to reach somebody. And I think Sheila, you didn't really ask it, but I think it's also underlying there. It's not just the problem with bias or hate crimes isn't we don't know who to call, but is that once we call, what does that mean? What happens? Does it mean anything? Does it go anywhere? You can call me, but if I can't do anything within the bounds of my job and my statutes, I will do nothing for you. That is the truth. I can get those emails, I can get those phone calls, but I won't be able to really help you other than you have notified me. It's my job to be notified of that. I can go to the legislature and say, this is how many notifications I got this year. It matters. Do something about it. Here's what I think you should do. But one of the questions that you asked is when you called the police and they said, what do you want me to do about it?
Yeah.
What do we want them to do about it? What is the appropriate response? I hate to put you on the spot, Gary, but like, what does the community want the police to do about that? And what is the appropriate response to that, Gary? Yes. Yeah, what should the trooper have done or the police officer have done?
I'm apologizing for that interaction. That's not the way we want it to go in any way. And I hear that, and I've heard it multiple times, and I get it. We get it as an agency. We're trying to do better on that, and it's like anything, it's chipping away, trying to get a whole ship to move and change a system is difficult work. And so that's the next part, is like, how do we handle those in, make sure that the frontline officer first is, as the Attorney General said, the dispatcher knows to get it to the officer, so we have to close that gap. And then once the officer gets it, that they are handling this appropriately. Because sometimes, as we've heard, it doesn't rise to a level of a crime, but there's the human compassion element there that that first line person needs to present and make you feel like, all right, we're hearing you, we understand this is a problem. I may not have the resources, and be honest, right? Like, I don't have those resources that can help you right here. That's not in my wheelhouse, but I'm going to connect you to this or that, and they have the resources that are going to go in this direction. But we're going to continue. Here's the number to call. I'm your case officer. That's the best. That way you have another point. Like, I've called here, and they're not able to help me either. All right, let's try another avenue. That's frequently what happens. As Sheila said, it can take several sort of touches of the system before we get a collaborative approach to solve these problems. They're complicated, they're difficult, and they don't always rise to the nature of criminal complaints. But that doesn't mean we're not doing it well. The community, we hear it over and over again, the community is not happy with the response. And that is part of being here, hearing that, making sure we start to change the way we can do this better. And that's going to mean training and making sure we hire the right people. And we're not there yet, and I hear that 100%.
Gary, can a officer who hears that report say, I'm going to come out and drive around, and I'm going to check him out and see if he's there?
Parts,
Can you do, is that an appropriate response to a phone call like that? Say, I'm just sending someone out right now to just drive around the neighborhood, make sure you're safe, here's my number. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I don't want to say yes.
I don't know, yeah.
It's a difficult answer for that. It's case by case.
Okay.
It does happen to us all the time, though.
Right.
We have a couple of people who haven't spoken here, and then Mary wanted to speak really quickly in Hartford, and then back to Jeanette. One of the things that came up in Hartford that we have been talking with the Attorney General about beefing up 211. It's a little known resource in Vermont that we have where you can call and ask about parenting and like resources, anything like that. You talked about using that as a complement to some of this so that people have a number that's not law enforcement that could, you got a thumbs up there, man, you got to move on that. So we're going to go here, and then here, I talked to myself, and then Jeanette.
Go ahead. I think we're starting to open up a little bit, and I think what we're hearing here tonight is some avenues that you can go to and how you go to. Problems are solved at the lowest level. When you call state police office, the local police office, the sheriff's department, and you get fluffed off, I would recommend elevate it, try to resolve it at the lowest level, but elevate it to the next supervisor. I mean, don't throw it in their face, oh, I want to talk to your supervisor about this. But don't be afraid to move it up. And then the sergeant says, hey, trooper, get out the new thing. Take a ride, go see this lady, show a little empathy. It may not be whatever, but you do that. The second thing I'm hearing tonight, we want law enforcement here. Where is Brattleboro PD? But do they come in uniform? Do they come with their guns? Do they come in plain clothes with no we have a representative of the town here that is the ultimate head of the department. I wish that he was here too. I like the presence of the uniform. I wore the green and gold for 28 years. I never had a problem with any school that I walked into, any organization, any college. When I did my speaking engagements, I wore that uniform proudly. And I think there's a lack of understanding why we have a uniform. So you can very quickly pick up. He's the only cop here tonight. He has a uniform on. So it does bother me. And that causes a division amongst law enforcement. People start to look at law enforcement like, oh, they're a stereotype. They're all the bad guys. You know, they got their guns, they shoot people. I caused the loss of 2 troopers losing their job. I was a whistleblower. And if I had to do it over again, I would have done it sooner. But we don't want bad cops. And I'll turn them in anytime. People who tarnish bad. I want people to look at law enforcement respectfully. And when they aren't respectful, go the distance and get them off the job, because all the bad people on that.
Okay, thank you. I think, go ahead. I think it's important to recognize that we need to stay away from the bad apple argument when looking at law enforcement and talk more about what Gary's been focusing on, and that is steering the ship, which is the culture that allows for systemic bias to happen, and that's why the AG is here tonight. So while I appreciate your comments, I think it's important to recognize that people like Sheila or myself or some of the other people in the room have bad experiences, not because of one bad apple, but because of, and your own parents are too, but because of a systemic culture. So I really appreciate that Sheila brought out the question about why are the uniformed officers here, or why, you know, like that's the community. Well, we'll go there later. Thank you.
And then, yeah.
So I think after I was speaking to this issue of internship, so I'm a pastor.
Lisa, can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. I'm a pastor. What?
Church voice.
Church voice. You've got the church voice.
Great.
No. I tend to be more in contact with the chronic illness of racism than with the trauma. I tend to live with people who are exhausted from day after day facing these things. So I feel like I come into the room more with that, but also sympathetic. But I was really struck, I don't know who you are, by what you asked. And to me, that is really critical to this conversation. I remember, you know, you look in the newspaper and you see, oh, this person was speeding, this person was arrested for drugs. You don't often see hate crime. And I think one of the things that does happen is, and I'm so glad to see Olga and Randy was here and Chris, you're here, that I think our media could be a big asset, and I'm really asking a question. Is there a way for police and for the government to be better about telling the end of the story, so we start creating a culture that if you do this, then that happens? And one of the things that I've been grateful for, and I don't want to dress this up too well, is that the Max Mish story, speaking of Kai, has stayed in the paper, so we can see that he is being held accountable. And I think that really changes the way people feel about the police. I don't know that whole story, so maybe you're going to tell me it's terrible, but when I saw that he was still being held to account, I was like, okay, we're doing this. I think similarly to you, if we had had an article in the paper, or if you had reached out to, somebody had reached out to the paper and said, this happened, this is what the accountable, it starts people thinking about the fact that when they do these things, we have a culture that holds people accountable. And I think that's often, I'm also thinking, one more, and then I'll stop. An incident that happened with, I guess I'm not supposed to say the person, who was in the paper, injured. I never saw what happened to that person. It was a hate crime, or close to it, if not. So we saw the incident, oh, isn't that terrible? But there was never, oh, and that person was held accountable for that fact. And I think a lot could happen, and maybe you're going to tell me that there's a confidentiality thing or something like that, but I do think if we think about really telling those stories of accountability, it would go a long way toward giving people hope, and that brings me back to my chronic illness thing. I really think that people get exhausted and they think, well, what does it matter? If I report this, nothing will happen. If you start seeing the stories, something happened, you might start reporting things, having the energy to follow through, that type of thing. Sorry to be so loud, but that was my point.
Please don't apologize, you actually have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to keep preaching, you got time.
Okay.
There are people ahead of me in line at the appropriate time. It's come up a couple of different times now about the flag and closure, and I'm prepared to speak to that when it's the right time.
Thank you.
So Mary.
Mary and
Jeanette and then
Sheila.
Sheila.
Jeanette was before me.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say that I think this is partly to Stefan's comments about hate crime and how we've focused on hate crime, and there is a very specific definition of what that is, and many things don't rise to that. So the goal in trying to do this was to say, let's start cataloging and let's start figuring out how many bias-related incidents, not hate crimes, but bias-related incidents we have, and how does that affect our communities, and how do we deal with it in our communities. And I think that's really important, and that it doesn't make any difference where you report those bias-related incidents, and you're not going to get law enforcement to charge somebody with it because it's not a crime. But if we start collecting all those incidents that are bias-related, then we can begin to see what is really happening in our communities, and where they're coming from, and how we're going to deal with them as a community. So that's all.
Mary?
I just wanted to add to that and say that I totally agree with that. And one thing that we've been doing as the NAACP is whenever we have something coming to us, we've been going to our lawmakers intentionally, because we've had incidences where, for example, something that we had to handle, 2 very well-to-do and respected and white community members reported an incident of straight-up discrimination for 2 individuals of color coming through our state en route to something. And there was, to this day, there is no record. There is no record. We found no record. One of the people put it in the paper, so if you go to the back of the paper, you can see it. But these are the things that, if that is not raised, it's going to go nowhere, because all of a sudden it didn't happen. We can't find the impounded car. We can't find, it's just like they vanished. And I'm like, okay, so are you, so it makes engaged community members out to be liars. And that disengages everyone, because they're like, I do have structural power. I tried to use this privilege that I have. And then what? So there is a bigger conversation here around, like Kevin said, culture that needs to be addressed before I think we get too into policies. But I will say that I think it'd be good if the AG's office and the civil rights organizations could co-create a process or could work together to do something. Because we've been talking a lot about what we can't do, and like, what can we do besides sit here and say that it's difficult? We know we're all struggling in our own respective lanes around that, so.
Can I just respond to one thing?
Sorry, my bad.
Mary's next.
Okay.
Is it related to that?
Yeah, go ahead. I just was going to say, we've trained people around hate crimes. I think we've trained police officers around hate crimes. We've never trained police officers around bias-related incidents. And so we need to now start focusing our training for police officers and EMTs and firemen and everybody else around bias-related incidents. Not just, so that's going to hopefully start changing the culture.
That's my segue, thank you. And so, I'm curious, I heard you reference that a few moments earlier when you were speaking about, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing here, like we're big on cultural competence, and so I'm curious if you could speak about, I do a lot of cultural competence, I actually don't like that term.
we're not really ever able to become competent in another culture. But I think implicit bias training, I think looking at issues of privilege and power are essential. I think that looking at white supremacy culture within law enforcement as an example would be an interesting training that I'd be happy to do with some of my colleagues. I'm curious, what kinds of training are you aware that's maybe happening in the AG's office, or how are you, as somebody who's taken leadership around this, engaging with that kind of knowledge and practice?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's all of the above, and we need to do more of it. We just had a great training at our annual retreat on implicit bias by Laura. It's, I don't let Laura speak for, you know, the work she did, but I will say this, that the reception from the office was fabulous. And you know, one of the struggles, Stephen, I appreciate your words of saying we need to stop talking about what we can't do and start focusing on what we can do. It's asking more, probably, we're all asking her too much, but to come in and to talk to the 150 of us about implicit bias and to spark the conversations. The training's not going to be, we're not going to solve the issue in the 2 hours, but it's the sustaining conversations that are sparked after the training. And I thought it was great. I hope it's the first of many. And it's needed in all aspects of law enforcement. Really in government, I mean, it's like Jeanette said, it's whoever's going to pick up the call, right? That's the most important person in this. Who's taking the call? Because it's not going to be me unless you have my cell phone. And that's across our government, which is mostly local government. It's going to be mostly local government. And I think we need to understand that the need for training is probably, and competency is needed. I mean, but I'll ask Maura to kind of speak on, you know, the conversation that started in our office and the issue of implicit bias training.
So I would say that the first training that we do around implicit bias is just not even a training. It is a presentation on, it is the buy-in, to get people to buy in that this is a real thing and that this is happening, and hello, wake up, you might have implicit bias, you probably do, right? But I start with you might, and then at the end I go, you do. Yes, but the deep dive happens in the second part, or the second training, or the third training. And my hope, and which we've really only started doing with the deep dive, is now that you buy into this idea, now what? And it goes back to what you said initially, Sheila, about discretion and points of discretion. And one of the great conversations that we had was, where are all of your points of discretion? Since you can't really trust yourself or your gut that much, because we belonged in a very systemically racist and sexist and whatever society. You can't trust your gut, so how do you mitigate that discretion? And what do we do? So we are talking about actual strategies to change that. So like if I was doing a training to an employer, after I get the buy-in, now how do you hire? Where are you advertising? Who are you including? What's important? Why are you asking those questions? Like, why is that an important question? And are you eliminating women when you ask that question? Are you eliminating minorities? Is that a question that is even relevant to the work that you do, that you need to get done here? And so we are trying to think beyond, like, oh, I have implicit bias. It's unconscious, and great, now I understand privilege, and that's not enough, right? So we need to go, like, now what do we do with that? So I would say that the AG's office was really open, and we had a lot of great discussions about that. But I think we all walked away with, yeah, there always needs to be more. That's not enough. That's just the beginning. And there are many points of discretion. At the HRC, that discretion is happening at every level by every single person. That's happening at the AG's office. That's happening at the police. Absolutely. There was discretion in terms of how they handled those calls. There's discretion about whether they forward those calls. There's discretion as to whether those emails will come to me or not. There's discretion as to whether I will open a complaint. Absolutely. And then the thing is, how do I mitigate that discretion? Knowing that I can't trust my gut, knowing that I could be biased, and how do I address that? And those are hard, but we are having them. They are good conversations. I think we need to be having more of those, absolutely.
Yeah, so the challenge, training on the one hand, and this is segueing into Sheila's initial question, but it's the application of that knowledge that is so critically important. Now, the way these four have been organized, it's been that the AG's office asked the three of us for our advice on how to roll these out and where to roll them out. So we provided information for maybe 45 groups that are run by or governed by Vermonters of color. We made suggestions about how far in advance we need to promote this. We had a series of questions that local community members should be asked by the AG's office that gets to your comfort level around whether or not law enforcement should be here at all, and if they do, in what form? Uniform, not uniform, weapon, not weapon. And we're on a fourth floor now. And we've tried to reinforce and continue to convey those messages, but they haven't actualized them yet. Maybe the last one.
Well, that was Rutland. That was my territory. I was one of the only people of color doing the work, so they didn't have a choice.
Right.
But in this one, that question that you asked should not have just come up.
Right.
It should have been answered before you got here, so I'm sorry that it wasn't.
Yeah. But again, the subject between the training and the coaching and the actual doing is what makes the difference. So it's not enough that we've spent our time and energy trying to advise the AG's office, but if that advice falls on deaf ears, then that's a challenge. So it's just not training, but it's having the courage.
Actually,
can I just ask, it's related to what Moore shared, and the Community Equity Collaborative has, over the past years, recommended, testified, met with legislators about legislative training that is similar to what the AG's office has had. Whether it's the AG office, whether it's the legislators, there's been a beginning that is very heartening to all of us as members to see happening, but why can't it be a requirement that there be deep, in-depth continuation that leads to the application that Curtis is talking about? I feel like when I hear, oh, we had 2 hours of training and Gore was great, that's what we heard about the legislative training. I think that is so superficial. And why isn't it that a curriculum can be in place that is, it's mandated, it's something the funding is there for, and it's seen as a key part of the cultural change that we all really need to have on the local level as well. But that's my follow-up question to the leaders of this forum is how can we make that real? That this is not superficial, 2 hours, and that's enough.
Well, I would say that it's not superficial because I think you're getting buy-in and you're getting people to understand a concept that some of them have never thought about before. And in that sense, it opens the door to the deeper training. But I will show up if you ask me. I always do. I never say no to training, and it will be specific to your entity and to what your needs are. Absolutely. And whatever the needs are, I'll be there. We never say no to training. But that, you have to have your legislators, 2 of whom are here, or 3? 3 of whom are here. They have to go, hey, we want more of that. They have to ask for it, and I'll be there, or anybody else will be there if they want it. Yeah.
You're cheaper than I am.
I am, I'm free. Yes.
And good.
No excuse.
So may it be posted then that is a request on behalf of?
One second, we want to make sure that he gets his time, and then we'll come back to recommendations at the end.
That's my closure.
Yeah.
That's all.
And maybe what I'm about to say is kind of where you're trying to go. I sort of, as we get closer to the time that we're supposed to, conclude this, I would really like to ask, I don't know if it's to y'all or to specific heads of different government bodies, but what action plan is actually coming out of this? Because I am so happy that we've talked about this, a lot of things have come out. I feel like there was a lot of great ideas, but I feel like this should not just stay here. And maybe it could be another community forum, maybe it could be, several people be like, oh, these are the action items, but me as a community member, I want to know what's being done with this.
I would teach Julio on this, because you've been taking notes for several forums now. And so that would be a question I would actually direct to your office.
Yeah, so we've been basically trying to get ideas. This, I would say, of the 4 that we've had has been more focused on solutions rather than descriptions of the problem. And I think both are important. So this is, I'm taking a lot of notes tonight. The idea is really to put together what are the common themes. We've seen a lot of common themes arise. And then I think one of those themes is more engagement with the community. So what we'd like to do is identify, kind of put our notes together and then re-engage with not only the familiar faces, but also the local justice leaders, the local civic leaders, to make sure that we're not missing anything and to focus, I think, more on what solution or sets of solutions you think are important. To give an example, tonight it's clear that there needs to be, not just here, but in our other 4 as well, that people need to have more information about multiple points of entry so that they can pick the one that feels the safest, maybe the most fruitful for them, and to have accountability for whoever has the handle to be transparent about what is going on with their complaint or investigation, and to make them accountable for that. I think some of that is going to come down to publicizing it through media, through written handout materials. One thing we're working on now is to have something that's county specific, so the local police officer hears something that's not a crime, but might be something else. Not only do we want them to refer it to us or to the appropriate office, but also to give the victim or the complainant, here's a 1-pager, 2-sided. Here are all the local numbers that you can call and to work out with the communities. So maybe that is Stefan, and it's not the state's attorney's office, and they might feel comfortable with that, or it's Pride Center, or it's Outright, or it's an organization that deals with accessibility for people with disabilities, physical and mental, and to have those relationships that we have. I think we have some of that with some organizations, but there are so many that we need to open that up. And so I don't think this is going to be, my perspective on it is it can't be just top down, like, oh, we have this great information, here are our great ideas, but just to come back and go through it with the communities we've been through to make sure we're not missing anything and to hear their ideas, because not everybody, 5 minutes per person or twice around 5 minutes isn't really enough.
TJ,
Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly, I love the police story. And I want to thank Gary Scott for being here, for being at every forum. And we want the Vermont State Police, who is the preeminent police organization in this state, to be the model, which they are, because all other police agencies will have to follow them. Sheila, you make a point that maybe they got a blind spot in terms of the uniform, and I'm happy to have that discussion, but I want to be very clear. I always invite the police. I always ask Gary Scott because I want them in the room. We need them in the room. We need them in the room. You make a valid point, and I'm happy to have the conversation. I know Gary is too, but I want to be clear towards your point. I invite Gary Scott, I invite the police. Without them in the room, we're not going to find the solutions. We need them. We need everybody.
It might be good if, pardon?
Yeah.
Can I? Oh, okay.
Right. You want them in the room. The challenge is, the reality is, what do community members want?
If you want community members.
And our advice to your office was, here's some questions that you need to ask community leaders well before the date arrives. Amongst those questions was law enforcement, present or not, if present, in uniform or not, so that would make the space much more inclusive and welcoming to community members. So,
And explaining the consequence if you choose not to have them in the room. Because if the problem is with policing and we don't have police in the room, then your point is well taken. And if your goal is to have your community show up, and your community says, we're not going to show up if law enforcement's there, then you have a choice to make. But they weren't given that choice, and I think that's Sheila's point. Yeah.
And I also gave feedback to that question that was asked, and I gave that feedback that if officers are in the room, that they should not be wearing their guns in a space, in this type of space.
So that's a breakdown that we need to have a conversation about for Bennington.
I just want to respond to that. I hear you. I'm also cognizant of the public safety of these meetings. And that at the end of the day is all our responsibility, but my responsibility too. And
Can you say more about what you mean by that, TJ?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
I'm sure there are people that are very displeased in this community that we're having this meeting. You guys know that more than I do. Public safety is always, you know this more than I do. But that's his job. And I'm happy to have the conversation.
But is that the role that Scott is in right now? Is my question. Is he here as an officer to protect us with his badge and gun, or is he here as a person from the force who is engaging in a community discussion? And I think that isn't clear. And I think I am going to wear many, many hats. And with each of those hats come different wardrobes. And so right now it is unclear to me when somebody is representing, why they're representing, and then how they're representing. So it's not clear to me that Gary Scott is representing, protecting us here tonight. That is not what you represented yourself as. It's not what I feel is happening in the room. It is not, if something happens, it's not something that I think is going to break out in that way per se. So I'm just a little confused that I believe you were here as a representative from your force who's engaging in community matters, which is different from being here as an officer who's being paid to protect us for something that somebody who isn't in our community is alleging is in existence.
I think it's a fair point, but my response would be, I think he's here in both capacities. He's always going to be a police officer.
But if that's not clear to this community, then we have not done our job in putting this forum together. And I think that's the accountability that needs to happen. Jeanette?
I was just going to say that you can ask the questions, but you're assuming that the community is of one mind. And I don't think there's any one mind in this community. So if you ask that question, some people might say, yes, they should be here and they should be in uniform. And some people might say, no, they shouldn't be here and be in uniform. And you have to make up your mind still what you're going to do, because I've not seen many communities that are of one mind.
But that was a dialogue that should have happened
Right.
with the community.
Yes.
Which is Curtis's point about this is why this conversation should have happened months ago, not tonight, so that you could focus on the solutions that you've been trying to come up with.
It's a hate bias. We're at a hate forum. We're at a hate bias forum too.
We gotta go in order here because it's starting to get, all right.
Sheila got skipped.
Can we hear from you? We have not heard you.
My name is Ellen. I live in Brattleboro.
Yes.
I'm sorry I was late. I had a prior meeting. I just wanted to comment. I mean, I missed the beginning of it, but I understand the topic of implicit bias is one of the things we're talking about. And one of the things that really is striking to me is that here we're having this conversation about implicit bias, and that depending on our racial background or how we're seen racially, our experiences with the police are very different. And that is the heart of implicit bias. Like, I, as a white person, might have had experiences where the police were protecting me and protecting members of my family, but I can't assume that that's true for all people of color. And I think that's like a heart of this issue, is like, do people, like, what is the implicit bias around that, and does everybody in our community, regardless of their background, feel safe coming into this space?
Okay.
And for me, I think I was really happy when Mary asked you to clarify about public safety, because like when you say public safety, is like who are you creating the safe net for? Because you tell me that a cop is going to be here with a gun, and I'm like, oh crap, am I safe? So really thinking about what public safety actually means and who your community members are, and if your conversation's about hate crimes, who do you want to be here, and how are you going to create that safety net? Which I think is maybe a conversation that could happen.
Diana.
Thank you. This is a different subject, but it's just one I was hoping we could address tonight. I really appreciated Emilio's opening, going over the different types of laws that relate to hate crime. Julio. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll get it. That you talked about civil, criminal, and violating free speech, and that there are different laws that, of course, relate to each of those, and some are weaker than others. It's just been so apparent witnessing what Kaya Morris experienced and what many community members experience regarding just relentless harassment. And I know that in the past session, I learned through our own legislators that there was there were a variety of different new pieces of legislation that were proposed. Some of them were from your department. Some were accessible for those of us that wanted to comment, and others were not. And I just wanted to get a sense of why some new legislation that is being brought to a committee is open for comment from community groups and others are not, and why that is the case.
I'm not actually the expert in
I don't think there's any piece
legislative
of
access.
legislation that isn't open to comment for people.
Okay, so my information was that the AG, that TJ and his staff were bringing legislation to be considered, and it was something that had to do with these topics. And so we just wanted to get a sense of what the content was.
Well, actually,
and we didn't.
They can't bring a bill.
Yeah,
they have to give it to a legislator who brings it, and then it comes to the committee. And it's all published, and it's all on the web, and there's no legislation that ever comes before a committee that isn't on the website and isn't published and isn't sponsored by a legislator.
I'm just telling you what we experienced from the Equity Collaborative regarding potential.
Well, we should talk about that afterwards, because it isn't true.
Yeah, I can just clarify a little bit about our office. We're often called to testify about bills.
And I've heard you testify, right?
Right, yeah, I'm still here, so it's...
No, it's great.
We play a couple of roles. One, to try to see whether the legislation, the language of the laws, because that's what the judges ultimately ding the legislature for, if the law is not precise enough to do what the legislature and ultimately the public wants to do. Sometimes it's to testify about what other states are doing. There are hate crimes laws.
Right.
There's no one uniform law of hate crimes. There are 50 states, and there are also cities that are hate crimes related laws. So sometimes we provide that information for the legislature.
And that's something that we brought up actually in our meeting with TJ, was that, Ohio, for instance, public officials like Ohio are protected. And so we were very interested in, are there ways that we can improve and deepen the existing legislation? I guess maybe it was just a situation where the committee had not finalized a piece of legislation to be under review, and maybe that's what
Could I speak to that? Just for 1 second. Just that when a bill is being discussed in committee, any current draft is publicly available, but it does not guarantee that every bill that's been drafted will have public testimony. So there are, in the House, 1,000 bills have been drafted. 150 of them may get substantial time for testimony across committees. And then there's also the chair of each committee decides what the schedule will be, what the agenda will be. Those are also publicly posted, but there's no guarantee. Generally, chairs try to invite stakeholders to comment. There's no guarantee that everybody who wants to comment will always get to comment. But I think that that's part of the tension is, who got a chance to weigh in, but also whether a bill was being discussed or not, which is a different problem. It's always publicly available.
Wait. We have had, the town manager and Sheila have been waiting forever to speak. So you, and then Sheila, we're back to you. Does that work?
Sounds.
Thank you. So I want to speak specifically initially to accountability and then talk about some things that the town is doing. So I probably take it too for granted that the structure of town government is such that the select board gets elected and makes the big decisions and meets a couple of times a month, and they appoint someone to be responsible for the operations of the town. That at this time happens to be me. And then all of the functional areas of town government are my responsibility. So I bump into occasionally times in meetings like this where it's not so clear to people that, gee, I've got a question about the police department, or maybe in different circumstances, the recreation department, or something else. And people feel like they need to talk to the chief or to the recreation director. Please feel anyone that I'm available if we need to be talking about something that's how Brattleboro town government functions or how we're interacting with the community or serving the community. Specifically in relation to the issues of the night, I want to make a bigger picture comment about what we're doing in town government and then give you a direct answer to the direct question about the flag. Forgive me for structuring it in this way, but it's intentional because when we get to the flag, you'll understand why I thought it was not worthy of my making a bigger deal out of it in the community. And I'm accountable for that if you think that it should have. We in town government had an epiphany 2.5 years ago when Curtis came to a community forum related to the election for select board at that time and called out that there were no people of color on the town staff. And he was right. And he asked us what we were going to do about it. And we set about trying to learn what we should be doing about it and better practices for recruitment and how to get about cultural change. I'm going to tell you that we very quickly, through a lot of communication with a lot of people in the community, learned about what was already going on around these issues, and we've tried to engage some of us who represent town government. We've tried to engage in constructive ways to learn more and be involved through the Community Equity Collaborative, through other activities in town, through some of the stuff that goes on out in the state. But we've been very slow to do cultural change within town staff and to do the training that's necessary to create the baseline and then to build on that with the follow-up actions that are necessary. And there's a reason for that I'm responsible for, so I want you to know it. Some of you do already know this, but I want the rest of you to know it so you can decide whether you need to give me a piece of your mind or whether it makes sense to you. One of the things that I realized was just a linchpin, an absolutely critical element of this, if we were going to do real cultural change within Brattleboro town government, within the employees who work for the town and for the community, was to have an HR function. There were 140 full-time employees and going on 200 employees, counting part-timers and seasonal employees, who didn't have an HR function. We didn't have a support system to live up to promises we might make about being more culturally aware and recognizing our biases and our privileges and our need to engage with the community differently than we have sometimes in the past. There is work that has been done around this in the police department now for several years, and I think it's important work and I think it's made progress. We're hearing obviously evidence that there's much more to be done. I hear that, and we'll follow up with the chief about that. But in the rest of the town government, nobody had touched this work. And so I wanted to make sure we didn't just do the training, do the 2-hour thing and the 4-hour thing and not have some capacity to make sure we were following up on it. And so government works slowly sometimes. It took a while to get an HR director funded in the budget. And it took longer than we had hoped to hire an HR director, but she's here. She arrived earlier this summer. She's great. We are already doing lots of things differently and better. Sorry, I'm going on too long.
1 more minute.
Okay. We're going to do the training. I needed to know that we could follow through. So now we're actually in the process of hiring trainers to do the thing that makes the baseline, to get people to understand what implicit bias is and build on that as we go forward. So we are trying to do kind of a part A and part B rather than just the part A, because we know we're playing catch up. And so it's going to be a full day of training rather than just some hours of training, and it's going to be not just sort of the basics of implicit bias, but it's that and cultural humility more broadly, so that we can start to make the progress to how are we going to behave differently, not just understand the situation differently. I guess I'll give you an answer about the flag before we leave.
No, go ahead right now. You got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. So here's what happened on the flag. With all that as backdrop, right? We're trying to go about laying a proper foundation and doing the bigger, harder, longer follow-through work that's going to be involved in all of this. I'm trying not to let, forgive me for using this term, but it's what it felt like to me at the time, little things get blown out of proportion into something that becomes an issue of conflict if it doesn't involve somebody actually behaving inappropriately towards people in the community. And here's what I judged about the flag. It was put up, I want to say, by a town employee, but not by a police department employee. I think that's important because it was the blue lines, the blue, thin blue line flag. And I get why it couldn't stay on that pole. And so it came to my attention the day that it went up. I don't know how long it was up, but it was a matter of hours, maybe only minutes. I learned about it at like 2 in the afternoon, and by 2:30 it was off the pole, and an American flag went up instead, and that's what's there today.
Time.
Thank you.
You got 2 minutes to respond just because we're running short on time.
Yeah.
And then Sheila, and then that's it. Sheila, you'll have 2 minutes.
I did have some, I know that you meant it at the time, but I did have some weird feelings about it being a little thing. I think I think to some things that actually got mentioned is that I don't think on the other end, on the community end, I'm not really hearing, oh, by the way, did you know that this training is happening? Did you know that this is also happening? There needs to be a connection between what we're doing in our government to actually make a difference and what community members are hearing. Because it may not happen a little thing. It may have been a little thing at the time for the government body, but on the community end, that's still with me. And that's still with everyone that has told me that that's happened. And that's still with everyone that I told that that's what happened. And there was no catharsis. So I think in fomenting this culture that we want to build, we need to, within this culture of humility, we need to build a communication line between the government, among the police force, and everything that in our operations and our community members to be like, hey, we're safe. In fact, we're gonna go into a community forum with you. In fact, we're gonna go and march in this parade with you. Let me guide you through this process. Because government is there to work for us, and if we don't have the communication that we know that they're working for us and they're working on themselves to work for us, then we feel that we've been left behind. We feel that nothing has been followed through with. Sheila.
Okay, I'm gonna be long-winded, but I'm gonna try to do this really well because I have some questions, but I wanted to bring into the space. I've been a victim of a hate crime here in this community about 2 years ago. Many of you are familiar with that. I was fortunate enough, after a lot of investigation, pleading, going back and forth, that the state's attorney decided to label it as such. And part of that, I think, was due to relationships, due to community, due to me being an advocate myself and really pressing it. But what ended up happening is it fell on death's doors because of going around and around and around. And then unfortunately that person left the state and unfortunately killed 2 people after he injured me. And so we go into talking about hate crimes, and there's no accountability for that because now he's involved in another case which is clearly more serious than mine, comparatively, and don't even know if there's documentation even if that was a hate crime because he wasn't proven guilty, he wasn't proven anything, he never went through anything with me. And so the documentation is really key for me. I have another incident where I had a neighbor who was profusely harassing me and decided to use Trump and use a Trump sign to put on my lawn and to threaten me, and had to build up a community support in order to protect me and my child in my own home. During this time, I was pleading to everybody and anybody, and finally it got to be to where neighbors had to call the police because that is not my first go-to. And during that interaction, and after meeting specifically with the chief of police for 2.5 hours in Brugger's, there's nothing I can do for you. When elements of what was going on absolutely rose to a crime. Absolutely. And there was no disorderly conduct, there was nothing, it fell on death's doors. So, I've had these experiences here. This happened 2 years ago, and 1.5 years ago to me. This is not something that's like in the history, and I can talk about my history and all those hate crimes as well. But that's not what I'm gonna focus on. So my questions are, when I was going through this, what I noticed and which you confirmed here was around punishment. The hate is a higher enhanced level geared to punishment. But as a person who, and I want to be careful to use these words, prison abolitionist, or a person who doesn't believe in putting people in prisons, the same people who beat me, who I thought were going to kill me, I fought for them not to be in jail. So when you talk about a hate crime, who I was a victim of, and you talk about this level of punishment, I wasn't asking for that level of punishment for them to be in jail. I was asking for transformative justice and accountability. And nobody really asked me what I wanted within those laws, and people punished me and punished them in a way that wasn't productive to him, to me, or to our community as a whole. So for the legislature, who I heard very clearly, the legislature has the ability to formulate the language around what we do when we respond and how we respond to hate crimes. And I'm concerned that it is punishment-only focused, that it's not about transformative justice, it's not about accountability, and it's not about community. There's a problem with that, is if we're only looking at this as an element to punish somebody more. That is not, for me, as a person who's been a victim, that is not what I am seeking. There may be people here who are seeking that, but that is not necessarily what everybody's seeking, or the totality of what we're seeking in situations like that. The other question I have is that threshold of proof. I had to go through multiple things and got turned down because there's no proof. Their word against mine. Oh, this, and this, and that. It doesn't ever rise in the prima facie, which is 51% or more for those who don't understand the legalese, of being able to figure that out. So that threshold, again, for the legislature, that goes to the legislature, that threshold is ridiculous. And I agree that we need to start tracking biases. Because if we were actually starting to track hate crimes or biases that weren't completed or reported and all those things that that come to all the agencies and organizations that are in this community, I bet you'd have your complaints that you're looking for. I bet you'd have your testimonies that you're looking for. So the other things I just want to say really quickly is, again, that alleged versus proven. If it's not proven, if you're not guilty, if you haven't been punished, then it erases, and it's like there's no even Google search of it. I want to know about timeline and accountability. So I file a complaint. Is there a timeline? I've got a timeline under legality. What's your timeline? And could that be explained and informed to people of when you shuffle us all around to the phone tree that we go to? What is your timeline? When does the marker start? When does it end? Because for people who don't need to seek legal remedy, that clock is ticking. And while everybody else is doing their business and the person who's most impacted is enduring those systems and those issues, that time is running out. That clock is running out. And typically the people on the other end do not have the resources to take the recourse that they want, including me very often. So I want to know also about when you do the training, and I appreciate that you're doing the training, and kudos for it's free, so there's no excuses. What's the follow-up? What's the follow-up? Who are they accountable to? I just found out that the State Academy every other year does a 4-hour fair and impartial training. That's it, from my understanding. And then if they want to, they can offer some other stuff. But that's it, every other year for 4 hours. Only in fair and impartial placing. And so that is just, it's not acceptable at all. And then the last couple of things I just want to say is around that tracking, having us be able to track is really key. And just again around that transformative justice is that not everything's about putting people in jail. Not everything is about us sitting down and being divided. Sometimes it's just about being able to say your truth, being recognized for that truth, and having somebody be accountable to that truth. And that doesn't have to be in this punitive way that we've been conditioned in our society to believe that that's the way we heal and repair from harm. So I'm asking the legislature to think beyond the punishment, beyond the criminalized ways, but also to recognize that there are people who, for whatever reasons, feel that way. And that's valid. It's very valid. It's not where I sit, but it's very valid. And so I'm concerned because I've been a person who's been directly impacted by these issues in my community, and I see it go around and around and around, and I want more accountability by the people who are supposed to be accountable to us.
I have to jump in after that wonderful peroration. Because we're at the end of the evening. What I'd like to put in here, and haven't had time to do, is to the Attorney General's office. We have been discussing ideas, recommendations, and this has been more, as you say, Leo, fruitful in that particular regard than other fora that we've had. Perhaps we've also been talking about transparency, communication, perhaps getting something out in some way to various community groups around the state that says, here are some ideas that we have that have come up from these fora. We'd like some serious feedback from you and your groups about this. And do it really, really in a very structured fashion. In other words, we need this by X date. To get some real traction here with a lot of the suggestions, a lot of the complaints, a lot of the concerns that have been brought up in the last 2 hours. I think that that's probably the most fitting way to wrap this up, is to actually get some feet under some of this. That the conversation's great, but I think now that we've been taking these notes, sending it back out in the way that we've been trying to do this and put this together. The action, you speak about the action.
Well, Julio mentioned it, this is something that we got out of Hartford, was that when we do this, either we come back through the same towns with an action report and do exactly what you're doing, seek the feedback, because if you just put it up on your website, most of us aren't gonna go there.
It's gotta come out in a different way. That's not
so in our next iteration, the next iteration is the walkthrough.
I think that's right. I think what we have to be able to add is just some things that we've learned from other parts of the country.
Great.
People we've met, like different parts of the country that have been working on the same issues so that we're not starting from scratch.
I just want to thank Sheila for really what I thought was the most compelling and best argument for restorative justice and the need for our community justice centers as part of this conversation. Because the hate, the hurt, the harm is real, and the healing happens in the community, not just in the courtroom. So thank you. I agree with you.
And thank everyone for being here this evening. I would hope, Peter, one thing, you might ask the BPD where they were. That might be a good conversation to have, because that was clearly an issue tonight.
And report back to the